For this presentation on climate change, I draw on the handprint care work to look at the inclusion of regional cultural capital and seasonal dynamics in the teaching of climate science and future sustainability in life skills curriculum. And the Climate Action Toolkit of handprint care was used to derive the necessary resources and information for the program. And the program was designed using an adapted Vygotskian framework from Anne Edwards, the 4-quadrant model, so that there was startup, story sharing activities, inquiry activities, some design challenge for the students to work on, and then some change challenges for them to explore in a series of lessons of about 3 or 4 lessons in the intermediate or senior phase. So if we start with the seasonal cycles in southern Africa, it's an area of high seasonal climate variability at the nexus of 3 interacting systems. We've got the Southern Ocean flowing up from the Antarctic. We have got the South Indian Ocean system, which has its cyclones, etc. And then we have the Intertropical Convergence Zone, which is the area that migrates with the seasonal movement of the sun. So the seasonal cycles across these climatic systems are influenced by the El Nino-La Nina oscillation in the southern Pacific, and this was discovered by scientists to understand the patterns of drought. These changes are all drivers of cycles of drought in the southern African subcontinent. So we've got a complex triad of interacting systems that make for climate variability in our region. Then these climate extremes come in many forms. Seasonal extremes in southern Africa take the form of heat waves, which we know very well, cyclones like the cyclone that swept into northern Mozambique and the earlier Cyclone de Moina. We had, to everyone's surprise, in KwaZulu-Natal a series of tornadoes, 5 in all, over a short period of disturbed weather. We get the high tides, flooding, and the driving winds that come into the coast and are eroding the coast. And of course, we have droughts. And all of these are linked to complex seasonal variations in climate. They are likely to increase with increased atmospheric carbon and with the greenhouse effect. So if we look at these social conditions and climatic conditions, it's very interesting to look at the end of season Galesha of the Xhosa. For centuries, the Xhosa experienced cycles of drought in the eastern southern Africa. Each year, as Orion's belt became visible in the night sky, they would know that the summer season was coming to a close and that croplands had to be cleaned in preparation for the next season. The cattle would be put into the fields to eat the remaining stalks of the summer crops and to fertilize the land for the next season. But then something interesting happened as well. The process of cattle cleaning the lands included Galesha, a breaking of the ground so that the winter rains would sink into the soil for the crops of the next season. In the same area, we had the Zuurveld migrations. If drought seasons developed, then the sweet pastures would not support the cattle, so that the herds would migrate to the Zuurveld in the south to graze on the nutritious Saarveld grasses that were high in nutrition over the short period of summer rainfall. As the grazing declined, the cattle would be returned to the Sweetveld grasses north of the Kai River, the Transkei, which would usually have recovered by then Even in bad years, the pastures were usually sustained into the new season by the lighter winter rains. So here we've got two processes of cultural adaptation to the climate extremes. And recent climate extremes in the Eastern Cape have produced a crisis of low dams with knock-on effects around the drought conditions. So we're starting to get a deepening climate action concerns. And this occurred, first of all, with the Makhanda water shortages because of the low dams, the low water quality associated with polluted water, increasing water costs because it was more costly to provide water with bowsers and also to clean the water. This led to declining food security, reduction in family nutrition, deepening poverty, expanding hunger, and increasing health risk. So the conditions of the drought brought about by climatic variation produced these conditions in Makana. And unrest and migration, well, we've been very fortunate, like in other parts of the world where unrest and migration have been associated with drought. In South Africa, we've been able to deal with the situation and keep people in water and food, even though there have been service delivery protests and difficulties at a local government level that are quite severe in some areas. So now, if we're wanting to look at these situations, drawing on the information from the past, then conserving water, family health, growing food, and family nutrition are really important in these conditions. And what I'm going to do is to share with you 4 stories. And the challenge is to how do we connect the stories with the past and try to look at how these connections can enable us to discuss the past to present question of what can be learned about the present from the indigenous heritage practices of the past. So here is the first story of Poliswa. Poliswa had a new baby and a young family that she was concerned about as the drought deepened and the taps in her street failed. She could not trust the water in the taps, so she jumped at the chance to get a rainwater tank from a local NGO. She was very proud of her beige slimline tank that had been installed by ingeniously suspending the gutters on wire brackets. Their RDP house had not been built with fascias for gutters, but the ingenuity of her husband solved this problem. The other mothers in the street celebrated the good fortune. After the first rain, Poliswa shared the pure water in her tank with the mothers who had babies and young children. A success story. On his way back home from work once a week, Rob, that's me, filled up his 5-litre water bottles at one of the few remaining perennial springs of Makhanda. He likes to imagine how the pure water being filtered through the wetlands and sandstone to become sweet water, the sweetwater spring that ran all year round. But the Xhosa and settlers of the old colonial town of Grahamstown had originally used the town's springs, but the growing town needed more water, so wells were dug. The wells were soon polluted with sewage from pit latrines, and dams were built to capture and store river water. The seasonal cycles of the Eastern Cape varied, so water storage in dams was essential to carry the community through the drought years. And again, here we've got a story that opens up into the modern era of how the water was stored and generated. Next, Abaye Golide, a youth group, noted how despite the drought conditions, Some of the old pensioners still managed to keep vegetable gardens. They approached the old people for advice, and with their help, started a compost gardening project in their street. People were already finding it difficult having to collect water from bowsers each day, and many gardens were already dry patches of weeds. The youth thought that people had to be ready for the rains if and when they came that year. So the best thing was to collect up all of the organic waste to make compost that could be used for growing food later in the season. Sam bought a house to ensure that his family had a roof over their heads after one of his employers moved away from Makanda and new jobs were scarce. With his severance package and all of his savings, he bought a house. He was fortunate to still have some gardening and home handyman jobs, but money was short. The drought meant that food was more expensive, so he started to go back to the old ways of harvesting wild foods at night so that neighbors would not see that he was poor. He also had made sour porridge from maize meal because he did not have money to buy bread. So there we have got the 4 stories, and what we can do now is we can look back, and if you can imagine a class having explored the climatics, the culture, and these stories, the idea would be, how do these things fit together? So we could go back to Galicia, we could look at the Zuurveld migrations, and then we could go more deeply into the seasonal use of fire to maintain grasslands, the collecting of clean water, amanzi amnandi, and using ututu, the reducing of health risk with cholera, that was part of that history as well, and the washing of hands, which would be relevant to the COVID conditions that we're in at the moment, protecting people in their homes by hand washing when they left home and when they came home and when visitors came. Maintaining food security with izala and water capture, the ensuring of nutrition to and avoiding poverty with imifino, amasi, amachewu, and isonka. So activities related to this would be enriching and added to the curriculum activities to deepen the discussions that the students were having around climate change. Now we wanted to connect the present to the future in the next series of lessons and bring in change challenges for future sustainability. Again, conserving water, growing food, family health and family nutrition, all really, really important to focus on. What can we do in drought years to come? And what are the connections that we could discuss in terms of past, present and future? Using emerging sustainability practices as inspiration, map out what could be done in the future. This would be the task that the students would be given. But we need to look at, well, can we have a deeper understanding of the situation by looking at the carbon cycle, perhaps? And here we've got a simple model of the oxygen and carbon cycle, which shows that plants produce oxygen and carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere. Then living things also generate carbon dioxide by using the oxygen, and so on and so forth, all the way up to us being part of the ecosystem. And the carbon dioxide doesn't seem to be increasing in the atmosphere at this stage, but if we look at carbon in water and soil and the humus, oil, gas and coal, then what we've got is a process of humans using these fossil fuels and bringing more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And I often use a simple challenge by saying, well, if all this carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere, then how come we're not heating up? And what was interesting to bring in is that there are natural buffers against increasing atmospheric CO2. And the modern industrial age has an atmosphere overloaded with CO2, but natural carbon cycles, sinks, and are working to mitigate atmospheric heating. But we're getting to the end of these, and this is where the crisis of climate change comes in. So when the carbon started to increase, well, plant capture continued. And soils hold carbon, but not as much as they used to because of agriculture. And wetlands and forests hold carbon biomass, but wetlands are diminishing and forests are decreasing so that there's less capacity. So the rescue has really come from the oceans as a vast carbon sink. And what the scientists are now showing is that the planet could be said to still have the systems to look after our species, despite the complexities of increasing atmospheric carbon, global warming, and climate change. But with more and more carbon in circulation, there are consequences like ocean acidification beginning to exceed planetary boundaries. So what I'm trying to do here is to deepen and explore the complexities, but at a simple level that can be deepened as we go on. So all of this means that we have to change, we have to make changes in how we use carbon so as to look after the cycles that are being exceeded. And this exploration of a system and this foundational work would be the basis for the students to look at present to future change challenges. And the tasks have been grouped into 3 so that there be a lot of diversity in the school. The first would be a carbon reduction innovation. How do we change things to reduce atmospheric carbon and create the futures that we want? The next is restoring habitats to sequestrate carbon and conserve biodiversity. And then disaster risk responses, design an extreme event response kit providing shelter, immediate relief, and some tools to restore livelihoods and life support systems. And the students would obviously work in groups. There'd be a lot of creative, generative work, and the loose but clear capital of cultural activities and stories and simplified frameworks could be built on and elaborated and challenged in the work that the students were doing together. So that is an illustrative example, and here are some references that I've used to try to explore climate change from another perspective, trying to look at it in life skills and trying to explore how culture, science, realities of the current disaster risk situations can be brought into a generative and exploratory style of deliberative ESD in a life skills lesson. I would really appreciate discussion and comments, and look forward to the discussion that we will have at ESA.